Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. Yes, I'm making my triumphant return after a literally gut-wrenching illness to bring you a new episode of utterly pointless comparisons. What game am I looking at today? Well, none other than the original Mortal Kombat, the arcade versus the Genesis versions. That's right, I'm taking a look at that awful, child-corrupting disaster that destroyed humanity nearly 30 years ago. Yes, it's a game that destroyed the very fabric of civilization by teaching children that it was okay to tear heads off of their fellow people with the spine still attached and just dangling there dripping blood. We used to have a pretty good world until it got destroyed. What's that? Oh, the world's still here? Well, I guess that means some of the politicians for back then were completely wrong and idiotic. My, how the times have changed. Alright, so you know the drill by now. Here's a look at the arcade and the Genesis specs while I tell you just a little bit about the game itself. So Mortal Kombat was released into the arcades by Midway in the fall of 1992. It followed the surprisingly huge success of Street Fighter II. You see, after that game came out and completely revitalized the decaying arcade scene, there were many copycats and lots of other fighting games that were released over the next few years. Now, Mortal Kombat was one of the first, and also really stood apart from the crowd thanks to its use of digitized actors instead of handcrafted bitmapped characters. Now, Mortal Kombat was not the first game to use digitized people in it, and hell, it wasn't even the first fighting game to use digitized people, but I would argue that it was the first one to use them effectively, and that the characters were large, well-animated, and controlled smoothly. Obviously, the game was a gigantic hit in its day, and hey, I like Mortal Kombat. I think it played fine for the time it was released, and it was definitely something new and interesting to look at back then. Now, I don't think the Mortal Kombat games have held up as well as the Street Fighter games, particularly the early ones released, in the early to mid-90s. And that's not to say that Mortal Kombat games are bad or anything like that. I just don't think their playstyle is as timeless. And yeah, I know, they're still making new Mortal Kombat games, and now they have wacky characters like, the Terminator, RoboCop, and Rambo, to name a few. Back to the original Mortal Kombat. So what made this game such a huge hit was obviously its incredible bonus rounds that were just so compelling, and there had been nothing like them before. It was either that, or maybe it was the extremely unrealistic and over-the-top violence. I can't decide which. It was the violence. So people thought it might be profitable for some reason to bring the monstrously successful arcade Mortal Kombat to all the home systems at the time. And they released it on pretty much everything possible, from home computers to home game consoles to portable game systems. One such version was the one we're looking at today, released for the Sega Genesis. This was published by Acclaim and developed by the UK software developer Probe. I'm not the biggest fan of Probe, and I'll get into that in the commentary and explain why. Now, the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat had all the blood and fatalities intact as long as you entered one of two codes at certain parts of the game. Either during the code entry screen at the beginning, you could enter Abacab with two B's at the end, or on the main start options screen, you could enter Dullard and then turn on the blood code through an option. Now, the Super Nintendo port of Mortal Kombat was developed by an entirely different company. It was made by Sculptured Software, and it was incredibly watered down because of the requirements of Nintendo. You see, Nintendo at that time decided that they were the gatekeeper of all that was prim and proper in video games, and they were the sole protectors and saviors of the world's children, and the only ones who could be trusted to make sure your kids were raised right. So because of this, many of the fatalities were edited down or completely changed, and all the blood was removed and the color was changed so it looked more like sweat. As one may have easily predicted back then, the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat sold significantly better than the hilariously sanitized Super Nintendo release. Because of this, Nintendo went full-on hypocrite for the release of Mortal Kombat 2 and allowed all the blood, gore, violence, and fatalities that could be stuffed into the game. But Nintendo, what about the children?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Alright, recording methodology. Yeah, I use save states before every round to make sure I can make these games sync up as closely as possible. You see, the AI in Mortal Kombat is a total and the difficulty just randomly spikes way up sometimes and drops way down at other times. And basically after round 3, you don't know what you're going to be dealing with at any point for the rest of the game. Other than the use of the save states, I have nothing to report, so sit back and enjoy. You know, if sitting back is your thing. And here we go. First off, the characters in the Genesis version are much smaller and severely color reduced compared to those in the arcade.
Sub-Zero.
As we get into the game, you'll see the idle animation is really weird on the Genesis. It's too fast, pauses and reverses at points, it's just super strange. And yeah, Sub-Zero doesn't even have his own animation in the Genesis port. He shares the frames of his best buddy in the world, Scorpion. Yeah, I know. They're not buddies. Next up, the background. It is likewise severely scaled back on the Genesis. It's got only a small fraction of the colors of the arcade original. It has fewer scrolling layers, and it's missing the guards in front of the monks from the arcade game. It also has an extra level of monks and is missing the entire backdrop of the mountains. It's weird when you notice just how empty the background is on Genesis. Aside from that, the temple is missing the lattice work from the arcade version. Okay, fatality time. Yep, lots of blood and dangling spine, check. On Genesis, we get less of a blood explosion when the head is ripped off, but get a more sustained blood drip afterward. Alright, here's Liu Kang, and hey look, the characters didn't get bigger between rounds. What a shock, I guess I won't mention that too much anymore. Anyway, the background here has been drastically cut back again on Genesis and looks incredibly basic and empty. The elements that are present are fine. The statues look okay, as does the temple and the gate. But we miss out on the gate on either side extending to the foreground, we miss out on the fire, we lose a scrolling layer of bushes, a layer of background of mountains, and a scrolling layer of clouds. On the topic of sound, the Genesis music so far is decent with nice percussion. The mood, or vibe, if you will, is certainly different and less menacing than the arcade original. It definitely sounds much more gamey on Genesis. Also worth mentioning here, this is an updated version of the Genesis game. It's a real official one, not any kind of ROM hack or anything, but this version features some music changing during fatalities, which was completely absent from the Genesis release, which you may have remembered. In the original Genesis release, the screen changed color and there was barely any sound or sound effects and the music just kept playing while the fatality happened. Here we are up against our only female combatant, Sonya. As far as the background goes here, once again, Probe has taken a chainsaw to the elements of the original arcade game. They changed the Liu Kang statue to one of the ninjas. They once again removed the lattice work. They simplified the columns. They removed the dragon banners which are present in other backgrounds. Why aren't they here? Who knows? They took out a layer of mountains from the background and took out the friggin' moon. Yeesh. The music in this stage is alright on Genesis. Again, it doesn't sound too much like the original when it comes to instrumentation, and they could have done a better job. But, oh well, it really could have been far, far worse than it is. OMG, it's a bonus round! These are so compelling! Now we fight Johnny Cage over the infamous pit. Yeah, Probe once again decided, hey Genesis fans, mountains aren't for you, okay? I can only imagine the artists of Probe must have had some deep-seated childhood trauma related to mountains. At least the moon is here this time. The music in this stage on Genesis is totally different than the arcade version, and worse in every way. Now the pit itself. Here we go as we take our trip down to the pit, and yeah, it's awful empty on the Genesis, and there's no screen-shaking crunch or thud once the character hits bottom. Alright, Kano in the throne room. Once again, the mountains outside the window were removed. Also, the fancy columns that line the background in the arcade game are totally absent on Genesis. That's right, Shang Tsung's castle on Genesis is held up by sheer willpower alone. Also, Shang Tsung's head moves in the arcade to watch the fighters as they go from one side of the arena to the other. On the Genesis, Shang Tsung sits completely still like he couldn't give less of a about what's happening right in front of him. The music is once again totally different in both, and I think much better in the arcade original, at least in sticking with the mood of the game.
Sub-Zero with fatality.
Here we have Raiden, which for some reason they spell with a Y instead of an I on the Genesis, and it makes me die a little bit inside every time I see it. Goro's Lair may be the worst looking stage of all of them in the Genesis version of the game. Whereas the arcade original has a very detailed floor with a cracked stone texture and bones strewn all over the place, the Genesis version has a few incredibly undetailed, tiny tiles that just repeat endlessly. Honestly, this looks more like what I would have expected from a Master System version than a Genesis version of the game. Also again, the music is radically different in both versions of this stage. The arcade game conveys tension extremely well. The Genesis version is just, well, kind of blah. And yeah, that's a technical term. Also, that skeleton in the background is too big on Genesis. If you didn't ever notice it before, well, you'll never unsee it now.
Sub-Zero wins fatality.
OMG, here's another bonus round. Alright, we've now wrapped around the backgrounds and are back to the first one. Somehow it still looks worse than the arcade original. Strange that hasn't changed at all. Sorry. So one thing I didn't have time to mention before is, look at the top of the temple just stops on Genesis. Yeah, they just gave up on drawing it there apparently. The arcade version doesn't go that high, and with no frame of reference, apparently the artists on the game had no way to work out what the top of that temple could have possibly looked like, for you see, it was truly an incompletable, impossible task. I'll also point out now the UI differences between the two versions of the game. I'm not clear why they changed the UI so much for the Genesis release, but it looks way less professional in every possible way. In the updated Sega CD release that would come along later, they would mostly fix it. I'll also throw in here that the Genesis version does get the gameplay mostly right, so at least from that perspective, it's not bad at all. I'm having some fun with it here, but it really does play dramatically better than the slow, laggy SNES version, even though it looks and sounds worse. Okay, the endurance matches. You have to fight two characters, one after the other. I always hated this when the game was new, and guess what? I still hate it now. And you know, as bad as Goro's Lair looks on Genesis, I think this stage probably looks worse. It's just so completely vacant, and the sprites even look extra jagged over that very bright and utterly devoid of detail background. Here's one thing I actually like better on the Genesis. If you look at the shadows on the Genesis version, they're actually transparent instead of plain black like in the arcade. Isn't technology amazing? Oh, I also forgot to mention before that Johnny Cage's shadow kick looks way worse on Genesis, with only one shadow instead of multiple. And his fireball is kinda skin-colored, so it looks almost like he's peeling some skin off to throw at you. You're welcome for that pleasant image. Who you fight in the endurance rounds is quote-unquote random. It's not really random, but it won't be the same two people in each endurance round every time you play, unless you get the same enemy roster each and every time. Also, I have to assume the guards in the background are very tiny humans, for they do not seem to be standing that far away from the fighters, and yet look incredibly small. And yeah, even though I tore everyone's head off earlier, they're back for more. Some people just can't stand having a head.
Sub-Zero wins fatality. Fight!
And back to the statues. There's nothing here we haven't already seen at this point, so let's talk a bit more about sound. The arcade version has way more voices and uses them much more often than you'll hear in the Genesis version of the game. The voices that are present on Genesis aren't too bad. They're a little low frequency and a little quiet, but overall they're clear enough. One thing I don't get is why this game is on a 16 megabit cartridge. We have a total of 9 fighters and 6 backgrounds. It seems like when it comes to sound and also graphics, this game did not use its cartridge size very effectively. I mean, it does have a decent amount of sample percussion, but even that doesn't explain where all the memory is gone. I mean, if we look at the original Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo, that was also a 16 megabit game. It had 12 fighters, 12 stages, more voices than this game uses, and way more music, all of which was sample-based. And also there was a lot more animation in that game. I just don't understand where all the memory went in Genesis Mortal Kombat. And yeah, while the arcade board was way more powerful using a 32-bit CPU, I feel like a much better looking and sounding version of Mortal Kombat was possible on the Genesis hardware.
Sub-Zero wins fatality.
Oh yay! Another bonus round! Take that, Anvil! Okay, the final one of these bullshit endurance rounds. Yeah, I fought Kano in the last one and also ripped his head off earlier, but you know Kano, he just won't let that keep him down. I guess I'll do my final analysis during this portion. In the end, yeah, gameplay is what's most important. Probe managed to make this game play like the arcade version for the most part, in terms of controls and timing. And even though it's certainly not identical, or even as close as, say, Street Fighter II and its 16-bit ports were to the original arcade game, it's still relatively close.
Sub-Zero wins.
You can do extra juggling on the Genesis that you can't do in the arcade game, and the AI is considerably different in parts. And the AI is trash in both the arcade and home versions here. It randomly shifts from Nursery School Easy to Doctoral Thesis Impossible at any time after round 3. Back to real time. What's cool in the arcade version here is as you get toward the end of this match, you can see the screen shake and you can hear grunts in the background. All of this is to foreshadow the very near arrival of your claymation pal, Goro. And here's the monster himself. Aw, they took out his stretching animation on Genesis and replaced it with his victory pose. Lame. Oh, and look, in round 1 here on Genesis, there are no shadows in this fight. What the f***, Probe? Don't worry, the shadows will be back for future rounds. The music in the Genesis just goes on with that dour, slow, dull, and completely uninteresting song that should have stayed where it belonged on the Game Over screen. That's not in-game fighting music, jeez! The arcade music is super energetic and again very tense and really fits the moment. I can't believe they didn't even attempt to adapt it to the Genesis version.
Sub-Zero wins.
And here we are at the main event, Shang Tsung. He throws skulls at you. In the arcade, he can blast multiple in quick succession, all on screen at the same time. On Genesis, he has to fire them one at a time. And once again, we get the same damn song on the Genesis as the last 2 fights. The arcade has a different song befitting a final boss fight. Yay for the arcade game! Boo for Genesis! Alright, and the big finale when you take out Shang Tsung is full of energy and flashing and voices and sound in the arcade. On Genesis, it's a silent little somber moment to reflect on all the people you've killed to get this far, I guess. You monster. Seriously, Probe, you couldn't even throw in an endgame jingle for 5 seconds? No. The answer is no, they couldn't. The endings are pretty close. The still screens look okay on Genesis, even though the font is terrible.
Johnny Cage. Kano.
Notice the cast is all on screen at once in the arcade, and only one at a time on Genesis.
Scorpion. Sub-Zero. Sonya.
now, the credits. If any of you probe guys are watching this, sorry for ripping on your game a bit, but in my defense, it definitely should have been better. Okay, thanks for sticking around, folks, I appreciate it. So, let's sum up Mortal Kombat for the Genesis. Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis is a very good playing version of the game that has severely cut back graphics and has severely cut back sound and music. And really, that about sums it up. The only other thing of note is that it really plays great using the Sega Genesis 6-button fighting pad that came out during its time. Now, I had this game when it was new, it was a lot of fun back then. Me and my family would play it against each other a lot, and there were many happy memories of ripping each other's spines out. So let's talk a little bit more about the Super Nintendo version by Sculptured Software just for a moment here. Now, aside from it being sanitized, let's put that off to the side for a moment, and say that it looks really good. I mean, they did a great job in capturing the graphics of the game. Now, the colors are obviously vastly superior to those in the Genesis version, since the Super Nintendo can show so many more and has such a larger palette. Now, the problem with the Super Nintendo version is it plays like you're controlling the game in a vat of molasses, and it's just very slow and sluggish and what the kids today would call laggy. Now, the music and sound is a lot more similar to the arcade version as well, but it's really muffled, and they used a lot of low-quality samples, which were common to a lot of Super Nintendo games of that time. In the end, I think it was right that the Genesis version outsold the Super Nintendo version during that era. Yeah, it's very frustrating in a lot of ways, because it should have looked and sounded significantly better than it did. Even if they would have just, added some more of the background elements in there and had them share a scrolling layer, so maybe we had mountains and houses on the same layer, instead of just saying, hey, let's get rid of those mountains. That might have made a big difference. It wouldn't have looked so blank and empty. And maybe using sprites to put the moon up in the sky in some of the areas, or having a few clouds scrolling by up above everything. All of that would have really went a long way to making this game look a little bit more professional. Now, a few of these problems will be corrected in the Sega CD version, but honestly, most of them were left completely alone, and that's a real shame. Maybe we'll take a look at that version someday too, huh? So that's about it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. And it would be super great if you could help spread the word about my little channel so we could help it grow. So what do you think about Mortal Kombat? Did you like the arcade version? Which home version did you like the best? Would you like to reignite the Playground Flame Wars from the mid-90s? Go ahead and feel free to do so in the comments. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.